When you look back at history, it's just, well, amazing how far people traveled, isn't it? And how populations moving around really shaped the world we know.
Absolutely. It's staggering.
Today, we're focusing on a really epic journey, one that unfolded over thousands of years. It starts way up in Central Asia, moves down across the Indian subcontinent, and eventually reaches, the incredible Himalayas, specifically Nepal.
Hmm.
We're going to do a deep dive into how Indo-Aryan speakers might have sort of found their way to this amazing region.
Exactly. And our goal today is really to explore this movement using the clues we have, archaeology, linguistics, ancient texts,
Yeah.
all drawing from the sources you shared.
Right?
It's definitely complex and sometimes debated, but it's important to remember, like you said, we're just looking at the evidence presented in these sources, not pushing any one viewpoint.
Absolutely. It's a topic with so many layers. So we'll look at where these speakers might have started, the routes they took, perhaps, how they interacted with people already there,
Mhm.
and finally, what clues we have about their presence and, influence in Nepal itself. So let's jump in. Where do we start looking for those origins?
Well, the general consensus, among linguists, archaeologists, puts the origin of the whole Indo-European language family somewhere in Central Eurasia.
Okay.
So specifically the Pontic-Caspian steppes, that huge area north of the Black and Caspian Seas.
Right, I've heard of that.
Yeah, and around the, say, late 3rd, early 2nd millennium BCE, we start seeing cultures like Yamnaya, then Sintashta, around 2200, 1900 BCE, and later Andronovo, maybe 2014, 50 BCE.
So quite a long period.
Definitely. And these cultures are seen as really crucial for developing what we call Proto-Indo-Iranian. That's sort of the ancestor language.
Gotcha.
So the key thing for us, thinking about that journey towards Nepal, is that this Central Eurasian region was like a major incubator for the language and culture of the people who'd later become the Indo-Aryans.
Proto-Indo-Iranian. So
Yeah.
that's like the main trunk, and then it branches off.
It's exactly right. One big branch leads to Iranian languages, the other to the Indo-Aryan languages we're focusing on.
Okay.
And the evidence suggests this migration, or maybe diffusion is a better word, of Indo-Aryan speakers into the northern Indian subcontinent probably started sometime after 2000 BCE.
After 2000 BCE.
Yeah, and it seems like it wasn't sudden, more of a slow spread during the late Harappan period, likely leading to, a language shift among some of the existing populations there.
So less of a big invasion, more a gradual mixing and changing of languages over time.
That's the picture that emerges from most of the scholarship, yes. What's really fascinating, though, is we find surprisingly early traces of Indo-Aryan language influence way out west.
West. Whereabouts?
Our sources mention the Mitanni Kingdom. That's in northern Syria, around the mid-2nd millennium BCE.
Syria. Wow, that's a huge distance. Why is that so important for tracking the later move towards India?
It is a big jump, isn't it? The key thing is finding Indo-Aryan loanwords in the Mitanni language.
Loan words, like what?
Well, names for gods Mitro, Uruvanashul, Indara, Nashatyana, which look very similar to Vedic gods like Mitra Varuna, Indra, and the Nasatyas or Ashvins.
Ah, okay, I see the connection.
And also terms related to horses and chariots, which were very important in Vedic culture too. So this suggests some kind of contact, maybe a ruling elite, perhaps even a small migration westward, carrying these specific words.
So even that early, we see elements of this culture spreading quite far.
It gives you a sense of the potential reach, yes. Now, bringing it back eastward, the Rig Veda, which is, a foundational text for this tradition, its setting is generally placed in the northern Punjab region, the Sapta Sindhu, land of 7 rivers. And that's during the early Vedic period, maybe roughly 1500 to 800 BCE.
Okay, the Punjab first.
Then later, in the later Vedic period, say 800 to 500 BCE, the center seems to shift eastwards into the western Ganges plain.
So a clear eastward movement within India itself over centuries.
Exactly. We see this kind of step-by-step progression across the northern subcontinent in the texts.
Now, you sometimes hear about the out of India theory. How does that fit in with what our sources are suggesting here?
Right. The out of India theory, it proposes that Indo-European languages actually started in India and spread out.
Okay.
And it certainly has supporters, especially within India.
Mm-hmm.
But most historical linguists find the evidence points the other way.
How so?
Well, when you look at how all the different Indo-European languages relate to each other, their family tree structure, and their earliest known locations, it just maps much more neatly onto an origin outside India, likely in those Central Asian steppes we talked about. The branching pattern doesn't really fit an Indian start.
Okay, so the linguistic family tree makes more sense with the Central Asian root.
That's the dominant view in linguistics, yes. But genetics adds another really interesting layer here.
Ah, genetics. What does that tell us?
Well, our sources mention studies showing shared maternal ancestry between North and South Indians, suggesting deep roots. But they also find distinct ancestral North Indians, or ANI. Yeah, ANI, who show closer genetic ties to people in the Middle East, Central Asia, and Europe. And then these ANI mixed with ancestral South Indians, ASI, starting maybe around 4,200 years ago down to about 1,900 years ago.
So the genetics actually shows evidence of this mixing between groups with different origins, fitting with the idea of migration.
It certainly seems to support a scenario involving migration and significant mixing, yes. It echoes that linguistic story of arrival and interaction.
Okay, that's fascinating. So building on that genetic picture, let's look at what the ancient texts themselves say about that eastward journey, which is obviously key to getting towards Nepal.
Exactly. The later Vedic texts and also the Puranas, they do talk about movement into the Gangetic Plains. One of our sources specifically flags the Bodhayana Shraddha Sutra as possibly recording this eastward migration.
Are there specific stories or people mentioned that hint at this direction?
There are. For instance, the Yajurveda mentions a figure, Yajnavalkya, being in Mithila, which is an eastern region. And the Aitareya Brahmana tells a story about Vishwamitra's sons migrating north. Another text, the Shatapatha Brahmana, talks about asuras being driven northwards.
North, not east.
Right, not directly east in those cases. But it still suggests movement away from the older western centers. So they're like little pieces hinting at this broader geographical shift eastward over time.
Right, so even the mythology reflects this changing focus, this eastward push.
Precisely. And then there's a really interesting bit in the Mahabharata, in the Udyoga Parva section. It actually describes the East as the original homeland of Vedic culture.
The East, that seems like a reversal.
It is, from the earlier perspective. It says the creator first sang the Vedas there. Now, this is from a later period, obviously, but it shows how the perception shifted, maybe reflecting the growing importance of these eastern regions within the tradition itself.
Wow, that's quite a shift in historical memory, or maybe legitimization of the East.
It could be. Now, turning specifically towards Nepal, the Puranic view offers some, well, intriguing ideas, though again, we're often in the realm of legend here.
Okay, what do the Puranas suggest?
One source suggests a Vedic Aryan presence way up in the Gandaki basins of western Nepal, the Harihara Chetra area, maybe as far back as 3,500 to 4,000 years ago.
That early. Wow. What could have possibly pushed groups towards Nepal back then?
Well, one major factor mentioned in some sources is the drying up of the Saraswati River.
Ah, the famous Saraswati.
Exactly. It was central in the early Vedic text, yet it started drying up maybe around 2,500 down to 1,700 BCE because of geological changes.
So climate change, essentially.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
It's incredible to think, but a massive environmental shift like losing a major river could have definitely spurred migrations, possibly sending some groups looking eastward and eventually towards the Himalayan foothills for more stable water sources.
That makes a lot of sense. Environmental pressure is a huge driver of movement.
Absolutely. And our sources also hint at conflict playing a role. The Rig Veda itself mentions a conflict between an Aryan king, Devotas, and a Kirata emperor named Sambara, apparently in that Sindhu-Saraswati region.
Kiratas, aren't they often associated with the Himalayan regions later on?
They are indeed. So this early mention suggests interaction, maybe conflict, that could also have pushed some groups eastward, perhaps towards areas where the Kiratas were also present or moving towards.
Okay, so we've got potential push factors like the river drying up and conflict, maybe pull factors like resources elsewhere. What about direct evidence or accounts of Aryan settlement in the Terai, the plains region of Nepal?
Right, the Terai. One of the sources we looked at, titled The Historical Development of Settlement by Aryan People in Terai of Nepal, tackles this head-on.
What does it say?
It describes Aryans, characterizing that source as entering India and then over time spreading into Nepal's Terai region, bringing Hindu civilization with them.
Bringing it with them? What about the people who were already there? Was the Terai empty?
No, definitely not. The source describes the Terai as already being inhabited by various pre-Aryan indigenous peoples. It also notes how the term Arya itself in ancient India got tied up with religion, cultivation, and ideas of, well, social status or respect.
Okay.
This suggests the arriving groups brought a social or cultural framework, which then interacted with the existing populations. The Terai likely became a real melting pot over time.
So interaction and mixing, again, not just replacement. What else does the Puranic analysis add about this entry into Nepal specifically?
Well, as we touched on, the Puranic view generally hints that some pre-Vedic and Vedic groups might have entered Nepal much earlier than, say, later well-known groups like the Lecchavis or Kumani Brahmins.
Right, earlier waves.
Possibly.
Mm-hmm.
Figures like Raja Harishchandra and the sage guru Vaishishta are sometimes placed in this early context, with their influence maybe extending towards Nepal.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's that legend of King Mathav Videha and his priest, Gautam Rahugana, marching eastward, maybe after 2500 BCE, possibly from the Saraswati region.
Merging east.
Yeah, and the Puranic accounts suggest this involved interaction with local groups, like the Kiratas again, maybe even the stories say, with the blessing of local deities like Shiva.
Interesting. So the legends themselves often incorporate this idea of interaction with existing peoples, not just conquest.
Exactly. It reinforces that idea of gradual expansion and interaction rather than just a sudden takeover.
Now, we should probably circle back to that whole Aryan invasion theory versus migration debate. You mentioned archaeology doesn't really support a massive invasion.
That's right. The term invasion theory conjures up images of large armies, widespread destruction, replacement of populations. And frankly, the archaeological record in the subcontinent doesn't strongly back that specific scenario for this period.
So what's the alternative view?
The thinking leans much more towards migration, diffusion, maybe movements of smaller groups over a long time. These groups could have gained influence, leading to language shifts and cultural changes through contact, intermarriage, and integration with the people already there.
So influence and integration rather than outright conquest.
It seems a more likely model based on the current evidence. It's about a gradual intermingling, a much more complex process than a simple invasion.
That makes a huge difference to how you picture it happening.
It really does. And this intermingling also means the cultures weren't just wiped out and replaced, they blended. The arriving groups adopted things from the existing cultures, and vice versa.
Right.
That's part of what led to the incredible richness and complexity we see in South Asian religions and societies later on.
And you mentioned language evidence for this too.
Yes, linguists talk about substratum influence. That's where features from an earlier language spoken in an area leave their mark on a language that becomes dominant later.
How does that work?
For example, certain sounds or ways of structuring sentences that might have come from Dravidian languages spoken widely in the subcontinent before seem to have influenced Indo-Aryan languages like Sanskrit and its descendants.
Ah, so the languages themselves hold clues about this mixing.
They do. It strongly suggests prolonged contact and situations where people speaking one language adopted another, but kept some habits from their original tongue. It's fascinating evidence for interaction.
It really is. Okay, so pulling all this together now, what's the sort of overall picture that emerges from these sources about the journey towards Nepal?
Well, synthesizing everything, the most plausible scenario seems to be this long, gradual movement. Starts with Indo-Aryan speakers, likely originating in Central Asia, then migration over centuries into the northern Indian subcontinent, followed by further movement eastward across the Gangetic Plains, and then eventually reaching the Terai and perhaps even the inner hill regions of Nepal.
A very long timeline.
Extremely long. And it was clearly a complex process involving lots of interaction, mixing, integration with the diverse peoples already living along that route and in Nepal itself.
And the exact timing and details are still debated.
Oh, absolutely. The precise timing, the nature of the entry into Nepal, these are still active areas of research and discussion. Scholars interpret the archaeological, linguistic, and textual clues in different ways, but the sources you gave us definitely offer some valuable glimpses into how this incredibly complex history might have unfolded.
It paints a picture of just immense movement, adaptation, cultural mixing, playing out over this huge timescale and landscape. So just to recap, what are the main takeaways for us today?
I think the key points are the likely origins back in Central Asia, this long eastward migration across North India that we see reflected in texts and linguistic patterns, and then the eventual presence of these Aryan-related groups reaching the Terai region of Nepal, suggested by both historical accounts and the Quranic traditions.
Right.
And crucially, remembering this wasn't one single event, but a really long, multifaceted process. Slow movement, lots of interaction. It really underscores how dynamic history is, how cultures and languages constantly blend and change over time. And again, this is all based on the material we looked at today.
It certainly gives you a much deeper appreciation for how the modern world, especially South Asia, came to be. So maybe a final thought for our listeners.
Yeah.
As you think about this incredible journey of people and languages,
hmm
how might these ancient migrations, with all the mixing and subtle influences we talked about, have contributed to the amazing diversity, cultural, linguistic that we see in South Asia now, and maybe specifically to the unique heritage of Nepal itself? What other stories might still be hidden there, waiting in the archaeology or the folklore of the region?
That's a great question to ponder. Definitely something to think about.